Welcome to Inside IR, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer that explores the latest developments in Australian industrial relations law and practice. Hello and welcome to Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast, the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest industrial relations thinking. You're joining us today for a special episode of Inside IR where we look ahead to the federal government's Productivity Summit and tackling the all-important question of what role IR, industrial relations, will play in unlocking productivity growth in Australia. My name is Rohan Doyle. I'm a partner in the industrial relations practice at HSF Kramer, and I'm excited to be joined today by my partner colleagues, Tony Wood and Wendy Fauvel. Welcome, Tony and Wendy.
Thanks, Rohan.
Hi, Ron.
Great to have you on Inside IR and looking forward to your insights on this very important topic. And I don't know about you, but I've had a little bit of deja vu in preparing for this episode, thinking back to post-election in 2022 when we were preparing for our episode on the Job Summit, looking ahead to that. And I know that, just reflecting on some of the commentary around the Job Summit, I know there are a few employers out there that perhaps looking forward to the Productivity Summit with a degree of trepidation. What do you think about that, Tony?
Skepticism. I have a low expectation of a positive outcome, to be honest, Rohan. We've seen a lot of positive talk already by the Treasurer. He's exhibiting the kind of enthusiasm from his mentor, Paul Keating, that might suggest that he has, serious ambitions. But on the other hand, we've seen previous reports of this nature fizzle out, and we haven't attacked and addressed the real important issues, at least as far as our clients are concerned in the industrial relations or IR space. So we'll wait and see what the outcome is.
Yeah, okay. Well, we will find out soon enough. But on today's episode, we're going to cover four things. Firstly, we're going to start with you, Tony, and you're going to explain to us what is productivity and what is the problem that we're trying to solve here. We'll then move to Wendy, who's going to tell us what do we know at the time of filming about the upcoming Productivity Summit? How are we going to solve these problems and what lies ahead? I'll then cover the interplay between productivity and industrial relations and talk to some of the battle lines that have already been drawn in that area. And then finally, we'll conclude with a bit of an open discussion about what we see as the potential implications of the summit for Australian employers and the role that industrial relations might play in improving Australia's productivity. So we might put our optimist hat on there, Tony, and just focus on...
Do my best. I'll do my best, Rohan.
That's good to hear. So look, let's start with you, Tony. There's obviously a bit of a problem here to solve on productivity. Why are we talking about productivity and what is the problem?
Well, they didn't teach this to me when I did my commerce degree back in the 18th century, but nevertheless, the ABS measured two elements, the Australian Bureau of Statistics measured two elements of productivity in Australia, which is sort of have global resonance. The first is multi-factor productivity, and the one that we're more used to is labour productivity, labour market productivity. They measure different things. I mean, multi-factor productivity looks more particularly at the interaction between capital and labour and ultimately how effective and efficient the economy is about producing output. Whereas labour market economy is effectively looking much more rigorously at the inputs of labour and how much output, or GDP if you like, is reflected through the numbers of employees and the hours that employees are working. So we look at those two measures. And the ABS data is quite helpful on that because it does tell us in both respects that although there is generally productivity growth with a few declines in relation to COVID and so on that we can look at historically, that our rate of growth, of productivity growth, is declining. Not only declining in Australia, but also declining relatively to the global economy. So when we're in a global economy as we are, we're competing, right, for services everywhere in education or tourism or manufacturing. So the rate of our productivity is declining relative to those other economies. So I think there's some data, I might have written it down here. So in the OECD, we're 11th in those economies and 16th in OECD in labour labour market productivity. And then there's a whole range of other measures we could look at. But in short, the data doesn't look particularly favourable to Australia from a global perspective. And I'm sure that's what's driving the Treasurer and others in the government to say we do need to look at how we can move the levers to get better outcomes.
Yeah, and that's important because we know the government's very much focused on growing real wages, but for real wages to grow over the longer term, we obviously need productivity growth. Otherwise, the growth in wages necessarily comes off the profit line. It's just not sustainable.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've seen a lot of comments from historically and even recently from the ACTU about this and wanting to take the issues of IR and labour market focus out of the productivity debate because there's an emphasis, perhaps understandably, that this is all about a drive by employers to cut wages. The price of labour is too much, and we've got to do something to stop that erosion. And as we've spoken about many occasions on these podcasts, the government's reforms, I think, have been particularly successful at ensuring that enterprise bargaining is becoming more relevant. And secondly, that labour costs have been driven up. We've seen that with the recent national wage case decision as well. So clearly and understandably, the ACTU and probably most people in the government don't want to see a reversal of that.
Yeah, I've got something to say about that, and we'll sort of come to that a little bit later. But before we do, Wendy, what's coming up for the Productivity Summit? What do we know, and how is the summit going to fix all of Tony's problems?
Thanks, Rohan. Probably background is there's a couple of Productivity Commission reviews that are happening as we speak. So there's really two. There's a main one that covers 5 main areas dealing with productivity. So the first is creating a more dynamic and resilient economy, which again, as you said, Tony, is really focused on tax reform, but is also reducing excessive red tape. The second is building a more skilled and adaptable workforce, which is focused on education and training. The third is harnessing data and digital technology. So think big data, AI, how we're going to manage that in the future. The fourth is delivering quality healthcare, which covers not only general healthcare, but also aged care, early childhood education, and delivering that more efficiently, which is pretty essential for those industries. And the fifth, no surprise, is energy transition. So they're kind of the 5 key areas that the Productivity Commission is going to be looking at. The kind of other review, which has been tacked on, is more around harmonising regulations. So think occupational licensing and how we can harmonise that and make that more efficient across Australia. The Productivity Commission review is happening now. So they're taking submissions. The interim report will be delivered in August of this year, and that feeds straight into the Productivity Summit that the Albanese government has announced. So really, I think they're going to be harnessing the recommendations of that interim report and using that as a kind of springboard for a very small cohort of people to discuss productivity, to discuss policy, and to really frame what the Albanese government's second-term agenda is going to look like. You look at what you were saying before about the Job Summit. There was 150 people attending that. Very small cohort. There's about 25 people at the moment that are proposed from unions, from government, from business, and from national experts that are going to be looking at this. But I think August is going to be a pretty key month for looking at what we're going to see going forward, when so much of what the government's talked about is really bedding down the legislation that they passed in the first term, and this is going to look at the future and what the second term is going to hold for us all.
Yeah.
So,
and we'll know a lot more, of course, once the Productivity Commission hands down its interim reports, because that'll give a pretty fair indication of the parameters of the debate, at least.
yeah.
But back to your point, Tony, I think it is really important that we're careful about the difference between the different measures of productivity, and labour productivity is a very different thing to multi.
We become a bit focused on that in our world because everything revolves around awards and agreements and wages outcomes and the efficiency or the restrictions or inefficiencies, if you like, that often arise at the workplace. But that's just one of the levers, isn't it, that the government understandably wants to look at everything.
Well, that's right. And there's different inputs into each measure. One has capital as part of the equation, one doesn't. And as a consequence, I think there's going to be different measures that are going to need to be implemented to address those very different metrics. And just to give one example, I mean, looking at artificial intelligence and the growth of that, I would expect that you look at the measure of labour productivity over the coming years. I wouldn't be surprised if that measure goes through the roof, just simply as a consequence of the improved technology in the AI space and also the ever increasing take up of that technology. Necessarily, we're going to see that reduce the amount of hours that need to go into producing goods and services.
True, but it's not unique to our country either. And in fact, if we don't get ahead of the game on that, we're going to, that comparative gap that I was talking about before is going to widen.
And that's exactly my point, Tony. That's the problem, because if we do pretty much nothing and just let all that play out as it will, you'll still see an improvement in the numbers, but not comparatively to every other country.
Correct.
Because every country is going to experience that particular type of labour productivity growth. So we need to do something extra, something that sets us apart, takes us ahead of that pack. And that's really the challenge, I think, for the upcoming summit, the government more generally. But I think it's also important, in talking about driving productivity growth, it's also important to ensure, of course, that workers receive a fair slice of that growing pie, so that they get a fair slice of the benefits that are delivered by increasing productivity growth. And I think that raises a really important issue, and one that I'm keen to hear your thoughts on, Tony and Wendy. We need policy settings that drive both labour and multi-factor productivity growth, but also we need policy settings to ensure that the spoils are appropriately shared. And I think sometimes, more often than not, in my experience, those objectives can pull in opposite directions, but they don't have to. And I think that's really the key for this upcoming summit and the policy debate that follows. We can't get sucked into this very sort of binary debate about sort of wages, cost versus productivity, because that's not helpful. But I think some of the early narrative that's emerging ahead of the summit is not all that helpful either. And I think if you look at, for example, ACTU Secretary Sally McManus has said in commenting on the upcoming productivity summit, we need to leave behind the idea that productivity is equated with cutting pay and making people work harder for less. Now, I'm not sure I've heard anyone say that. I don't think that's anyone's position, to be fair. And I think it's really important we don't take the debate down that path, because it's not going to solve anything. I think if we're going to make any progress on the question of productivity, we need to ensure that unions, employers, our politicians are all on board with not using productivity as a bit of a political football. We need to focus on what is quite a complex problem and try and solve that together. To take another perspective, you've got the Business Council of Australia, Chief Executive Bram Black, who has said, lifting business investment is essential to boosting productivity, lifting real wages, creating jobs, and ensuring more opportunity for more Australians. Now, that's exactly the point. So the objective is, let's increase wages, increase real wages. But we do that by actually promoting productivity growth, growing the pie so that it can be more appropriately shared.
Or could I suggest we could take steps to make the system more efficient and take away the red tape and
Well,
make
that's how
it
you
easier?
grow the pie. 100%. That is one of the many measures that we should be looking at to growing the pie. But Harding, another positive, I guess, is that our Prime Minister is saying very similar things to the Business Council of Australia. On 10th of June, Prime Minister said, the starting point for our government is clear. Our plan for economic growth and productivity is about Australians earning more and keeping more of what they earn. We want to build an economy where growth, wages and productivity rise together. But the Prime Minister also said, we're a Labor government. We support unions existing, and some of the commentators prefer that unions didn't exist. That's the truth, but we'll always respect both the role of business and the role of unions. And one of the things that I say is that there are common interests that you don't get union members unless you've got successful employers. It's the private sector that drives an economy. What the public sector should do is facilitate private sector activity and private sector investment, and that's what my government is focused on. Now, that's really, really positive, and we're very much focused on increasing real wages and doing that by increasing productivity growth, and that's exactly where we need to be focusing this debate.
I wonder if is Albo saying that you only get union members if effective. Is he making a comment on the continued decline in union membership, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think that's acknowledging the fact that the government needs to support business, growing the pie, and that is how you deliver secure jobs, better pay, to use that terminology. That is how you do it.
Well, you didn't take the bait, Ryan, so well done on that one.
Thank you, Tony. Camera's rolling. But I think that brings us to the real crux of this issue, Tony, and we'll start with you. What role do you see IR playing in this productivity debate?
Well, that's a huge question, and I agree so much about what you said about this can't be a low wages discussion, because you just totally lose focus on that. I think everyone wants BCA. Others have said they want better wages outcomes. We are seeing, whether all of us like this or not, certainly many employers don't like it, that enterprise bargaining, the economic coercion through the threat of taking industrial action or protected industrial action is more effective. We've seen an increase in protected action bargaining orders applications. We've seen an increase in lost days through strike action. We've seen all of those constituent elements of a more robust bargaining paradigm playing out right now. So that is resulting in higher wages as we speak, over the last 12-month trend. So that's a positive outcome for at least workers, at the very least. But there's this elephant in the room that I've been banging on about for ages and ages, and it really annoys me that there's so many vested interests at keeping some of the elements of our IR system entrenched for 100 years that we can't see the forest for the trees. Am I mixing all my metaphors here? The problem is we've got this very, very restrictive award system, to be perfectly honest. We call them modern awards, and they're modernised to the extent that in 2010 we kind of went through this process of plain Englishing them and consolidating thousands of them into hundreds of them. But the fact is they're extremely restrictive, prescriptive. They don't help, in my view, either workers or employers. They don't encourage employment. They are impossible to interpret is going too far. They are extremely difficult to interpret. In many situations, you don't even know whether a person is award covered or not because there's so much ambiguity in relation to them. And then we look at that factor of awards and say this award system underpins bargaining. So we've got the complexity contained within awards, which is reflected through, I won't say lazy bargaining, but easy bargaining, where you just perpetuate and roll over agreement after agreement, which is based on the award wording, which is unclear. And we kind of perpetuate this situation, which is so damn difficult for employers, whether big employers or small employers, because the awards apply to everyone, irrespective of your size. And the level of prescription is so hard. Personally, I'd like to see real courage from the government and actually, frankly, from the ACTU as well to say, yeah, we need to improve this. We made some huge structural changes to the Fair Work Act where we've introduced over the last 20 years the national employment standards, minimum standards and conditions of employment for all people without necessarily the level of prescription and detail that go into awards. If someone in the health sector, there are multiple classifications and increments. It's just so damn complicated. And yes, we see the problems perpetuating through the regulator, the Fair Work Ombudsman, having a role in enforcing them. And of course they have to enforce them. And that creates complexity where they're spending precious resources and public money on doing, having to look at investigating whether someone got an increment of an increase when they moved up a classification a year ago or 6 years ago. And it causes frustration for, I know, our clients about having to comply with those. So rant over. The award, I would love to see someone have that real political challenge to say, let's see if we can make a system that's better, doesn't cut wages, preserves, if you like, what people have got, but just remove the intricacy and the inefficiency and the inflexibility of awards.
Yes. And look, you've written on this topic recently,
yes.
Tony, and I've seen some of the commentary online. I'm not sure if you've read some of that yet.
No, please don't tell me. I best avoid it.
The problem with this topic is then you get some commentators who say, oh, you're trying to strip away hard-fought conditions and protections, which, I mean, I know you, Tony, that's not what you're saying. You're saying we need to simplify them so that you encourage people to start businesses, to grow businesses,
Got
to
to have
hire
the
people.
courage to address the sacred cows.
Mm.
And, for someone to say, oh, IR's off the table or anything is off the table, come on, have the courage. Get into that detail and realize that it's been getting worse and worse and worse. And like, I'll give you one example, and it really annoys me that a few years ago, the Fair Work Commission, which has got power to apply and to vary awards, consistent with its obligations under the Act, created what I thought were trying to create a more flexible system in allowing employers to have what's called an annualised wage, because awards are otherwise prescriptive on having to make payments in respect of each particular pay period. And they created a monster so complex and so difficult that that our clients won't even use that because it's too complicated. And I know they've done that with a warm heart in being kind to the Commission, but in fact, they've gone overboard and over prescriptive, and it's just meaningless.
Well, imagine if you converted a proportion of the hours that are currently spent on compliance activities to delivering the product and or service.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, there's some pretty easy wins there. But I think I'd take your point a little bit further, Tony. I agree with it, but it's generally about red tape, and it'd be great to see this a portion of this debate actually focus on not looking at initiatives that fit within the current regulatory paradigm, because you're then operating with pretty narrow goalposts. It'd be great to actually just start with a blank sheet of paper and think about what do we need to do to drive productivity in each of those 5 or 6 areas that you spoke to, Wendy, without feeling constrained by our current system. Wouldn't that be great? Well,
job done.
We'll see.
But it's hard. I mean, it's hard politically because of the whole reasons that you've already explained, and people will entrench in their own little bunkers and fight it. But hey, look, this government's got a great opportunity right now to be able to really do a Keating-esque kind of reform. So
and I think you do that by reassuring unions, employees that, look, don't worry. We hear Sally McManus's comment. Don't worry about the safety net, and everyone's on board with real wages growth. We all want that. Let's just assume that we're going to make sure that we include protections so that the growing pie is shared fairly. Let's just leave that to one side for a moment. Let's actually first work out how to grow that pie, because that's the problem that we've got at the moment. But Wendy, interested in your reflections, where does IR sort of fit in this debate?
For me, and perhaps I think something that we're definitely going to see is AI. It has to be part of this discussion. You look at the parliamentary reports that have recently come out on this, there is no doubt this is going to have an impact on our economy. As you said before, Rohan, even if we did nothing, it would have an impact. But this country has to be an early adapter of this technology to not be left behind. And I think so much of this is about working smarter, not harder. It feeds very neatly into this real appetite from the union movement to work less hours. We have to see the efficiencies in really overhauling so many of the tasks that we do and making them more efficient through the use of this technology. So that's really, I think everyone's on board with that, but there's a lot of fear around it. And we're at this kind of critical time, I think, where there's various Senate committees that have looked at this, and other parliamentary committees around how are we going to regulate AI. We obviously have existing laws there that are in some ways can adapt to that, but what is that going to look like for the next stage of this when, I'm sure most businesses in Australia are going to have huge digital transformation projects. We have to be running at speed with this to keep up and to be a key player in the global economy on this. The worst thing we can do, I think, is by putting up brick walls and more red tape. I'm sure we have to kind of bring workers along the journey. And some of the ACTU comments in leading up to this summit and not just focusing on kind of retraining economies that are going to become more automated or consulting with workers at an earlier stage. They're also talking about, taking some of the protections out of enterprise agreements, so the permitted matters concept, dealing with the content of enterprise agreements, taking that out so that more prescription can be put into enterprise agreements about AI. Question whether that's going to be one of those brick walls. Or they were talking last week about, workers having a right to refuse to use AI in the first place. So some of these restrictions, I think, are going to be part
that
of
would be a
inevitably.
mistake, wouldn't it? I mean,
Total mistake. We have to bring workers along the journey. There has to be, some transparency in how we're integrating this into all of our workplaces. But really, we're at a critical point where if we just keep putting in red tape, it's just going to really hamper the overall picture in relation to AI, when we need to be working at speed and focusing on the amazing innovation that this could be.
Yeah.
And I don't think robots are going to take our jobs. But hey, if the robots can make some of the admin around our jobs more efficient, it's going to make workplaces a lot more efficient overall.
Yeah, agree. And that's why I think if we can somehow give everyone that comfort that whole question around workers sharing in the profits of this increased productivity in AI and other initiatives, technology, if everyone could feel comfortable that was going to be the case, I think you'd get a lot more engagement with the initiatives that will help us grow that productivity. So I'm really interested to see whether we can create that kind of environment for a really productive, open, sort of blue sky type debate. But what is clear to me is IR is going to be front and center in this, no matter what anyone says. I think that we've already heard there are some initiatives in the IR space that will help unlock productivity. Even if that's not the space we're playing in, you'll need IR to deliver a lot of the initiatives in unlocking productivity. There'll be changes that will impact workforces. We'll need to consult. We'll need to implement changes to terms and conditions. This is going to be relevant to IR as much as everyone wants to talk about tax. There will be impacts on workforces, and for that reason, we'll be monitoring this closely, and we encourage all our industrial relations practitioners to do the same. So thanks, Tony and Wendy, for your insights on this. Looking forward to you monitoring the details that flow out of it over August and beyond.
I'll go and read some of that feedback on my article and see what it says.
Yeah, I think most people recommend that you don't do that, Tony.
Okay,
but
fine.
Anyway, we'll see how we go. Also, we actually do love to hear feedback on Inside
We do,
IR,
yes.
Tony. We encourage that. So feel free to comment, direct message, or send an email to insideir@hsfkramer.com. And don't forget to tell your HR and safety colleagues about our new podcast in the inside employment and inside safety space as well. I think we're up to episodes 2 or 3 on those as we speak, and they're getting some great attention. So do check those out. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Inside IR.